Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. We're here to present the second public meeting for the Lynn Coastal Resiliency Study and Risk Assessment. We want to inform you of the results of the risk and vulnerability assessment that we did as a result of the modeling of sea level rise and storm surge for different climate scenarios. We want to listen to any public comments and concerns regarding the study in terms of any problem areas or anecdotal information that you may have, and you can give any of that to Lynn EDIC, Mary Jane Smalley, and Bill Bachnack are here tonight. Thank you. I'm Frank Riccardi with Weston and Sampson. We're the consulting firm doing the study along with Anchor QEA, and Rob Almy is here with me from Weston and Sampson, and Erin Healy and Mark Mahoney from Anchor QEA. So they're going to bring you through the second part of this. If you remember the first public meeting that we had, we talked about setting up the study parameters and what model and climate scenarios we were going to use for this study. We did use those in our risk and vulnerability assessment. We met with a lot of the city organizations, DPW, Lynn Water and Sewer, Inspectional Services Department, and got all of their input into this study so that we could do the analysis and see what is at risk for sea level rise and storm inundation scenarios. So the project team is going to bring you through the rest of the study, and Rob Almy will kick it off.
Good evening. This is our second public meeting, and we're here to talk about a vulnerability and risk assessment, which is the fourth task in our work plan, and we will talk about the estimates of water levels and the project scenarios. We'll review those. We went over those in our last public meeting. We'll show you some inundation maps. We have large versions and we have some on the slides. We had a working group meeting where we reviewed with a number of the city agencies the results of this preliminary assessment and to get their input, and we will eventually prepare a final assessment based on their input on the work so far. The first part of our presentation will be by Erin Healy, and we'll focus on the estimates of water levels and how they fit into the risk assessment.
Hi, as Frank and Rob said, that the last meeting we talked about project scenarios, and in this phase of the project we went through and calculated what water levels would look like in the future under sea level rise scenarios and those scenarios with a storm surge. So basically the way we did that was to estimate the water levels. We looked at sea level rise. We got the source from NOAA. We didn't have to go back and do any kind of science to figure that out here. These are published sources. So we used that, and for the storm surge we used multiple lines of evidence, including a model called SLOSH, which is used by the National Weather Service to forecast weather. And we also looked at FEMA mapping of flood zones. And in that way we estimated what the storm surge would be. On this slide, this shows a graphic that is a little easier to understand. The blue on here is, you can see the bars on the left. Those colors are 2016, and the reddish purple are 2066. So you can see how we layer this on top of each other as far as figuring out the water heights. And the first one is where the high tide is, and that's defined as mean high water. And then the second one is a king tide. The king tide is when planets line up, and it happens a couple of times a year. And if you remember last fall, we had a pretty extraordinary king tide that was, I think it was 7 feet above, not 7 feet above, but like 3 feet above the regular high tide. The next one is a storm, and then the next one is waves on top of that. So these all add up to form the highest water level that would occur. So the waves that you see there would be the waves that would occur under a 100-year storm. So what you can see from this, if you look at the top of the waves, there are two sets of waves there. The lower ones are for 2016, and then the other one is for 2066. So that's the difference that you would see in the 100-year storm wave level between those two dates under sea level rise scenarios. These are just the water levels that were used, and Rob's going to talk more about the risk assessment. This is 2016, and this is what a high tide looks like. And this is 2066, a storm surge plus a high tide. So the maps, those are the maps that we generated based on the water levels that we calculated, and the maps are shown up here, and that forms the basis of the risk assessment. And that, the date on that first one was incorrect.
2066.
It should be 2066, the first one. Yeah, okay.
Once we have the water level elevations at various points in the future and under various conditions, we then identify all the facilities within the highest water level. And if you look closely at this map, there are a number of points and names. We identified the entire area that is potentially inundated in 2066 by a 100-year storm, identified all the facilities in it, and then began a formal risk assessment. Next slide. So the risk assessment involves identifying the infrastructure and resources within the inundation zone and identifying the elevation of those facilities, as well as what's called a threshold elevation. The threshold elevation is the level of storm surge or tide that would cause the facility to either be shut down or otherwise fail and not be functional. So in other words, if you have an intersection and there's a foot or more of water in that intersection, the intersection is generally considered impassable not only to regular traffic but to emergency vehicles as well. Once we have generated the threshold elevation for each of the critical facilities and intersections in the inundation zone, excuse me, we estimate the probability of flooding above that threshold depth for all of those resources. And this involves comparing the probability of a 100-year storm, which is 1%, a 10-year storm, which is 10%, and high tide, which is considered 100% because the water would reach that level twice a day. We then calculate the elevations for each of those conditions: high tide, 10-year storm, 100-year storm, for present conditions for the year 2041 and the year 2066. And then we estimate the consequence if the water exceeds the threshold elevation. We define risk, at the bottom of this slide, we define risk as probability times consequence, probability being a number, probability of an occurrence, and consequence being the results of a facility failure or inundation. This is a simple graph that shows severity of consequence on the bottom scale and probability or frequency of an occurrence on the left scale. And this type of an approach is very common. Probabilities that are very low and consequences that are minor are considered low risk, and probabilities that are high combined with extensive or catastrophic damages are considered high risk. So this is the classic explanation of risk. And again, we assumed that if a facility's threshold elevation was exceeded by a tide event, then the probability of the failure of that facility was 100%. If it took a 10-year storm to reach that elevation and cause failure, then that was a 10% risk, and a 100-year storm was a 1% risk. And then we turned our attention to consequence, and instead of saying, well, this has got a high consequence or a low consequence, we tried to be a little more specific about it, and we looked at environmental effects, which include ecosystems and whether say, a spill or other kinds of result of flooding could be contained. We looked at community, which included health and safety, emergency response, damage to cultural resources, or other kinds of important facilities in the community. And then we looked at economic consequences, which included how long would a facility be out of operation and what's the cost of repair to that facility. The consequences of failure were all added up and then assigned a probability as to whether an event would occur in under present storm conditions, future high tide or storm conditions in 2041 or 2066. We listed then, ended up with a consequence score, and then we multiplied that by probability to end up with a weighted risk score. And these are some of the numbers. For example, the MBTA bus terminal had a relatively high probability of inundation and a moderate consequence, and therefore it ended up with a relatively high risk score. The National Grid Power Station, our preliminary estimates suggest that there's a relatively low probability of failure of that power station, but if it did, it would have very high consequence. So as a result, it has a moderate weighted risk score. So these are examples of the assessment that we did, and we tried to rank all of the critical facilities and intersections within the inundation zone. These numbers, there's nothing magic about the weighted risk score. It's simply a way to compare relative risk. The decision makers in the community can then look at these relative risks and decide how they wish to address them. We will be addressing some of the ways of dealing with the risks and potential failures in the next phase of our report. With that, we're looking for any feedback we can get.
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to point out, too, that the numbers are still draft. We're still working with the city groups to finalize the numbers and vet them out. And we want to take all the public input as well. And we'll be generating a comprehensive list of all the facilities and their risk scores and the probabilities of a critical threshold being exceeded. So at this point, there's going to be ample opportunity for public comment. You can reach out to Lynn EDIC. Anyone here tonight is able to be reached via email. And we would welcome all of the public input. The next stage of the project is to finalize the consequence listing and develop adaptation strategies for dealing with some of these inundated areas. So that's where we are right now. This is a very preliminary study meant to enhance the shoreline of Lynn. It's a very positive project and will serve to really enhance everything that's going on in the development and the natural areas in the Lynn shoreline. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today or watching on TV. And we do have some folks here. If there's any comments or questions, we'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks very much. I'm Joan LeBlanc from the Saugus River Watershed Council. Just a couple comments and maybe some questions. First, thanks very much for your work. You've obviously been very busy using all the best data and analysis, and I'm just really pleased to see Lynn doing this project in such a proactive manner. It's going to be so valuable for protecting both environmental and economic resources. Also, really pleased to see that the scope has changed a little bit over the past few months to be taking a look at a broader range of scenarios. I think that's really valuable for planning under different storm scenarios, because we truthfully don't really know what will happen in the future, so it's good to have a wide range there. And then in terms of just constructive feedback, I do think that there's opportunity to take a look at the process for figuring out the various risk scores. Do I understand correctly that once that's completed, those scores will be used to inform efforts on adaptation? So if something gets a really high score, it's at risk, and therefore, if you were trying to prioritize, funding should probably go toward those that have a high score in terms of what do we do to protect this site. Is that correct?
That's certainly one way the risk scores could be used, but you are forcing the comparison of apples and oranges. So there'll have to be some judgments that the community makes on how the priorities are actually set.
Okay, thank you. So knowing that once numbers get published, we all really use them quite a bit, I think there's opportunity to look at the weighted scoring system and maybe make some adjustments. So without specifying any specific properties, I just think that, for example, there's a couple on here. There's one where it's a grocery store and another where it's an industrial facility that has some hazardous materials. And they're ending up with a similar score, and they have a similar threshold. So if I were just thinking of, okay, prioritizing funds or efforts to secure a certain area, I would be much more concerned about the industrial site that has potential hazardous material. Because obviously if a grocery store closes, that's a problem for the community. It's definitely an inconvenience and a hassle, but it's not going to cause a public health or major environmental concern in the way that flooding on an industrial site would. So just looking at the specifics, I think there's some opportunities there. I'm not sure exactly what the best route would be, but we can chat about it separately, and maybe some higher weighting for those sites might solve it.
Yeah, Joan, we definitely would, there's a lot of subjective input that goes into the risk and vulnerability assessment. We'd be happy to sit down and get your input. The reason why the grocery store rises because it affects a lot of the population.
Right.
So that gets a higher score for that impact. But like you said, environmental impacts and contamination issues to natural areas are very important as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of vetting and ranking that has to go through, and the more input that we have on that process, the better, so that everyone feels comfortable with the final list.
Right, and I don't want to downplay the concerns, because, it's just a different type of adaptation. So maybe an adaptation plan for the store is some busing that's available to an alternative location for people living around there. And that's probably a lot more affordable than having to clean up environmental spill. So just a different type of response needed. So great, thanks very much, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thanks, Joan. Okay, I just want to look up the next public meeting date. I don't know if the project team knows it off the top of their head. I'm going through my calendar right now to find it. Thank you. The next public meeting date is set for May 31st, 5:30, same room in Lynn City Hall. And thank you all. Thanks, George. I can't believe we own this.
That one thing.
2006. How many levels of people? Normally you do, that was a 20-minute, have at least a half an hour of folks commenting.
There is some ways, I'm sure you know.
I think it gets, like, the grocery gets a high thing, because it impacts a lot of the community, so it gets a high score there.
Yeah.
And there's probably also, it could be a transportation issue too, like that if you can't get to it, it also gets